Kirkuk, what are you seeing?
Well, I was in Kirkuk earlier today and saw the federal forces come in and take control of the city. I believe that the situation there now is calm. The majority of Peshmerga forces left there without fighting, and it was Kurdish citizens with guns who kind of stayed behind to skirmish with some of these advancing Iraqi forces. But they did end up coming into the city and taking control.
What about people who live there? Have they been fleeing?
Yeah, I mean it's a quite an ethnically mixed city with a large Kurdish, Arab, and Turkmen population. A lot of the Kurdish families were really worried about potential sectarian violence and were fleeing in their thousands today, blocking the roads north for hours. But you also had some Arab and Turkmens who were quite happy to see the Iraqi forces reassert control over Kirkuk, which the Kurds have had since 2014, but the federal government has never relinquished their demands for control of.
This show of force from Baghdad, how strong was the fight that it essentially got in Kirkuk?
Well, it was actually, I think, a bit of a remarkable display of brinkmanship. This is all stemmed from the Kurds holding this independence referendum last month, which they thought would win them a lot of support. And Baghdad, gambled that if it, made a big display of force, issued them an ultimatum to leave, that the Kurds, without support of the international community, wouldn't stay and fight over the city. And I think there was obviously some deal for the Peshmerga to withdraw rather than to stay and fight, because I think it was pretty unexpected that so much territory was given up without this reverting into a new civil war in Iraq.
Thank you very much for the update. That's New Zealand journalist Campbell McDiamond joining us from Kirkuk in northern Iraq. It's 7:18.
Health authorities are warning of the increasing agricultural pollution in Canterbury drinking water that is potentially lethal to newborn babies. Data from the Regional Council shows that nitrate levels have risen almost a quarter of the private drinking water wells that it had monitored for the past decade. And that has the local medical officer of health worried. Here's Conan Young.
While harmless to adults, nitrates cause blue baby syndrome, which can be fatal to newborns. The Canterbury Medical Officer of Health, Dr Alistair Humphrey, says an increase in the levels means the risk of infants under 6 months developing the syndrome remains real.
We don't know how many babies have been affected. Not all will die. We certainly have anecdotal accounts from mothers in the Canterbury region whose babies have been very unwell, and then when they have removed the high nitrate water, their babies have recovered.
Alistair Humphrey says while there's only been one confirmed death from blue baby syndrome, the actual number could be higher, as some may have been mistakenly attributed to sudden infant death syndrome. He says increased irrigation and the dairy farms it supports are to blame for the increased risk posed to infants.
I think it's inappropriate that we should be subsidising irrigation schemes around the country, which potentially put the health of our community at risk.
The Regional Council's groundwater science manager, Carl Hansen, says those with higher nitrate levels are concentrated in farming areas running south from Christchurch all the way down to Ashburton.
Farming has become more intense, and that means you need to have more nutrient, more nitrate available in the soil for plants to grow, and that leads to more nitrate leaching.
Carl Hansen says while only 7% of monitored wells exceed the safe drinking water standards for nitrates, a quarter of the wells are coming close.
They're not above the limit, so they're still potable, but it's just sort of a flag that the concentration is maybe getting up there, and so they need to do extra monitoring to make sure that the concentration stays below the limit. And that's the responsibility of the water supplier.
The Regional Council's acting chairperson, Steve Lowndes, says like many he struggles with the twin targets the council must meet under planning rules to increase the amount of irrigated land on the Canterbury Plains, while at the same time improving water quality. But he says in future irrigation will not be used to grow grass for cows.
We will be going into much more finely tuned agricultural endeavours. So irrigation isn't the bugbear. It is actually, historically, what it has been used for, and that is what we're trying to change.
So far, high nitrate levels in Canterbury are confined to private wells, and none of those serving communities have been found to have dangerously high readings. In Ōtautahi for Morning Report, ko Konanyang tēnei.
21 minutes past 7 now. Well, officials in the Republic of Ireland are still urging people to stay indoors as this tropical storm Ophelia batters the British Isles. 2 men and a woman are now reported to have died as a result of the storm, which has had gusts reaching 170 kilometres an hour. It's knocked out power also to more than 300,000 people. Helen Vaughan is a former RNZ reporter now based in Dublin. Welcome to you, Helen. Can you tell us how bad the storm is right now?
It's pretty bad. I'm in Dublin. So basically the eye of the storm at the moment is off the northwest coast of Donegal. So that means we're still bearing the brunt of half of the storm, if you can kind of imagine it. But it's basically really, really, really windy. It hasn't been that wet on the east coast. So Dublin's on the east coast. The west coast has been pretty wet. But the storm made landfall around 10 o'clock this morning on the southern coast and basically battered the south of the country. As it moved up, I guess it moves over land, so it weakens a little bit, but still the west coast is getting battered. Dublin has been pretty bad. And basically the entire country was put on lockdown. From yesterday evening, it was red alert for the entire country. Schools closed, colleges, creches, courts, banks, shops. Everything announced kind of between last night and first thing this morning that they weren't opening today and that everyone was basically to stay home. And you know, when they make that warning, don't make unnecessary journeys, and you think, oh yeah, but I'll still go to work. Like people actually didn't go to work today, which is quite a big deal for an entire country to kind of shut down, stay home. And, you know, as is proven by, there's been 3 deaths, which is really tragic. But 2 of those were people in cars with trees falling on the cars, which makes you think, if all those schools had been out with kids going to school and all of us going to work, you know, the death toll would obviously be higher. But it's one of those times where people actually listened and they said, this isn't a storm that's going to weaken by the time it gets to Ireland. It's still going to be packing, you know, hurricane type winds, storm force, gale force 12. You know, and they were right. And I kind of waited for it not to be as bad as they thought, or they said, and it has been as bad as they said it was, which is amazing.
I've just been watching some of the video and some of the pictures coming out, massive trees across roads, pretty dramatic stuff. How rare is this in Ireland?
Very rare, because I was trying to compare it to Wellington, because having lived there for 5 years, I was thinking this kind of thing probably happens in Wellington maybe twice a year, or am I overstating it slightly? Whereas here we're not used to this thing. Most hurricanes start down in the Azores near Africa and head over towards the Caribbean and the US. They don't come northeast to Europe or to Ireland. Like our last hurricane was in 1961, Hurricane Debbie, and I think 15 people died then. And I guess with the different kind of warnings they have now, social media you have now, and the way everything can spread within an hour, you know, the whole country would know last night that we were on red alert, push notifications to your phone. You know, just communication is so quick. And I just think people really listened. But still, 1/5 of the country is without power tonight. The worst of the storm isn't over. Some of those 10% might be out for 10 days. So, you know, it's still pretty bad. They've announced that schools are going to stay closed tomorrow. Great for children. But I guess they haven't done a cleanup. They haven't seen what structural damage there is because lots of roofs have blown off buildings. You know, and it's kind of, we haven't even got to the mop-up. We're still hunkered down and literally batting down the hatches, you know, for another, I'd say 5 or 6 hours to go.
Thanks very much, Helen. Helen Vaughan there, former RNZ reporter, now based in Dublin. 24 minutes past 7.
Well, the New Zealand First Board and MPs will resume their deliberation over whether to form a government with the National Party or with Labour in just over half an hour's time, or an hour and a half's time rather, at 9 o'clock this morning. The Labour leader, Jacinda Ardern, is with us in the Wellington studio. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, we heard from Bill English yesterday that there had been talks going on over the weekend between National and New Zealand First. Is that the same situation for Labour?
Yes, I can confirm that both parties appear to be in exactly the same negotiating position, in that we have been focused on policy discussions and deliberation.
And was this about clarification being sought on particular issues?
Oh, a range of issues, both clarification and just general discussion as well.
Was that directly between the leaders, between you and Winston Peters, or was this a different form that these particular talks took?
Certainly I've been involved in the responses, but I think, as Mr Peters may have said, that there had been letters exchanged, so those responses have been going back and forth in writing.
What does that indicate to you, that this was continuing over the weekend when seemingly the talks had all finished last week?
Oh, no, look, no, my full expectation was that there would be some further back and forth. I think the indication is that policy is what is driving this decision. And that I would hope people would take heart from, that the discussions have been dominated by areas of consensus, agreement, disagreement on the issues that matter, and that it hasn't been a discussion or negotiation that's being dominated by what particular roles individuals will play.
Have you discussed that at all?
That is how we have been entirely focused on policy.
So nothing about ministerial positions, for example?
It's all been about policy.
So at what stage does that potentially get talked about if it is going to be Labour that's forming the government?
Look, you have to eventually have a discussion around the nature of the agreement because the Governor-General, of course, cannot confirm that a government's being able to be successfully formed unless she can see that there is the confidence of the House behind that agreement. And so that means knowing that there's either confidence in supply or a coalition agreement or some iteration that demonstrates that the votes are there for a government to be formed.
And in terms of whether it's confidence in supply or a full coalition, is there any kind of indication as to which way that may go if indeed it is Labour that is the party that will be leading the next government?
It's been a discussion entirely focused on policy. Of course, both parties, I have no doubt, have had done their own internal thinking around the iterations of those agreements. But at this point, it's been a policy-based discussion.
Policy-based, but on that score, is it looking like it's going to be full coalition with ministers, for example, from New Zealand First?
That would be fully speculative.
Okay.
It's been a policy-based discussion.
So you haven't even got as far as to get over the line as to whether it's confidence and supply or anything more?
As I say, it's been a fully policy-based discussion.
OK, so if ministerial positions haven't been talked about at all, was there contact, for example, yesterday, or is it something that has stopped because of New Zealand First now being in this meeting?
Oh, we've had ongoing exchanges, and you know, I do want to have some caution here around breaking down too much the nature of those ongoing discussions. But to again reiterate that there is, people should take some heart by the fact that they've been dominated by the nature of the government that will be formed, rather than just simply around ideas of position. Of course, the ability of a government to be both stable and durable ultimately comes down to whether or not you have enough commonality to form a government that's going to last the distance. So that should be where what the conversation is dominated by.
Now, as for the Greens, which is the other side of the balancing act that you're essentially navigating here, is there a deal that has been done with the Greens? Is that something that has been signed and sealed, essentially? Yeah, I think the way that I'd be most comfortable describing where we're at with the Green Party is that we've had a positive exchange and negotiation. Essentially, that is essentially concluded and did so last week. We're pretty much ready to go, is how I would describe those talks. Of course, the final stage of those talks, though, would essentially make that deal public, because the process that the Green Party in particular would need to go through is quite an open one on their side. That would, of course, mean that being out there before we've concluded our negotiations with another critical party to forming that stable, durable government. Of course, the Greens are aware that we're still in negotiations and talks, and so having that other agreement made public whilst we're still in that position is something that could potentially compromise our conversations. Yeah, I appreciate it's a very tricky situation that you're talking about here. There's some sequencing that needs to be thought through, of course. But with the Greens, have you talked ministerial positions with them, for example? As I've said, we're pretty much ready to go when it comes to those negotiations. That doesn't tell me whether you've talked ministerial or not. It tells you that we've pretty much concluded those talks, so we're ready to go. So you know whether settled. That's a confidence and supply setup or whether it's sort of in the cabinet? Everything is pretty much settled in that regard. Are you able to tell us what the outcome of that situation is? Okay. But I wouldn't want to undermine the party processes that both sides need to go through. Okay, so the Greens then how much are they able to know, if that is the setup that you have with them, how much are they able to know about what is being talked about with New Zealand First? Because obviously the Greens are going to be part of this government as well.
Oh, certainly they're certainly aware that we're in policy discussions at that at this point.
Do they know which policies are being particularly talked about?
As we've said from the very beginning, we've been making sure that in our negotiations that we are respecting the confidentiality for both parties. And so Labour has engaged separately with the Green Party and separately with New Zealand First. That is not unusual. A blind negotiation is the way that all negotiations have been conducted for past governments, and that's the case in this case too.
So I guess the Greens just have to trust you because they're essentially signing up to something blind as far as what New Zealand First is asking of you.
Oh, we are negotiating separately with both parties. Of course, we have to be mindful that in the coalition or agreements that we sign, that they are compatible with one another.
Are you sick of being interviewed about this?
No, it's my job. And of course, we are only just over a week out from where the final tally came in. In my mind, we absolutely need to make sure that we go through a considered process. This is the government that will be presiding over New Zealand for the next 3 years. We do need to make sure that we undergo this process properly, that we consider as many issues as we can before a government is formed. And I think that's what all parties are undertaking to do.
When do you anticipate the public of New Zealand knowing who's going to be running the country for the next 3 years?
Some elements of that decision making are out of my hands. Of course, we have our own processes, so I therefore respect that other parties have theirs. The indications seem to be this week, but I certainly wouldn't want to make any assumptions.
Thanks very much for your time. Jacinda Ardern there, Labour leader in the Wellington studio at 28 minutes to 8.
Coming up before 8 on Morning Report, a private tertiary provider is investigated by authorities. Auckland Council looks to make beaches in the city smoke-free and some other public places too. Well, other headlines with Nicola Wright.
The Labour leader Jacinda Ardern says discussions with New Zealand First have focused solely on policies. She told